Behind the imposing walls of the casa-grande, secrets were hidden that history tried to silence. While the plantation masters flaunted power and wealth, in the shadows of the senzala, enslaved women were marked by fear and suffering. Iron chains and invisible chains bound them, not only to the ground, but to a cruel destiny, to serve without choice in the torment of the night. This is not just a narrative about slavery, but a deep dive into pain, resistance, and the memory of lives that were used as currency for pleasure and power. By following this story, you will understand how that brutal past still echoes today, and why remembering is also resisting. From the earliest days of slavery in Brazil, the social structure was built upon a foundation of inequality, violence, and exploitation. In the imposing casa-grande lived the plantation masters, men who held land, wealth, and absolute power over the bodies and destinies of those treated as merchandise. Surrounding this space of ostentation and luxury stood the senzala, a place of pain and submission, where the enslaved were crammed after exhausting days of forced labor. The physical distance between casa-grande and senzala symbolized the brutal separation between oppressors and the oppressed. It was a geography designed to mark the social hierarchy and to reinforce, with every step, the presence of the visible and invisible chains that upheld the system. The plantation master was seen as an almost divine figure within the estate. His desires became unquestionable orders. The wealth accumulated from the cultivation of sugarcane, coffee, and other crops was only possible thanks to the sweat, blood, and tears of the enslaved. That man represented not only economic authority, but also power over life and death. His gaze could decide whether someone would be punished at the whipping post, flogged in the town square, or simply discarded when no longer strong enough to work. To maintain this regime of terror, there was the overseer, responsible for watching, punishing, and enforcing discipline through force. The senzala was the space where hundreds of men and women were crowded together in inhumane conditions. The environment was suffocating, dark, and unsanitary, marked by the smell of sweat, open wounds, and suffocated hope. It was there that shackles rattled night after night, binding the feet and dreams of every captive. The iron chains were visible symbols of physical imprisonment, but there were also invisible chains, even more cruel, that imprisoned the mind and destroyed self-esteem. These chains manifested in the daily repetition of the idea that they were inferior, that they were born to serve, that they had no future beyond servitude. This symbolic violence was as devastating as the lash of a whip. Within this system, forced labor was relentless. From sunrise to sunset, the enslaved were forced to cut sugarcane, carry logs, plow the land, and perform all the tasks that sustained the luxury of the casa-grande. The slightest mistake, the slowest pace, a gesture of exhaustion, any of these could be interpreted as insubordination and result in brutal punishment. The whipping post, the town square stocks, the lashings of the whip, and the heavy shackles were instruments used not only to punish, but to instill collective fear, which maintained order through terror. The public torment of one captive was also a warning to the others. Resistance could come at a high price. In this setting, enslaved women suffered even more intensely. In addition to the same forced labor that men endured, they were seen as available bodies, marked to also serve the desires of the plantation owners. Their vulnerability was exploited both inside and outside the senzala, in the silence imposed by the power of the masters and the watchful eye of the overseer. These women carried within themselves a double oppression. They were enslaved by the system and victims of a cruel patriarchy that turned them into instruments of pleasure and domination. This dimension will be explored more deeply in the next chapter, but it is already important to understand that the slave system was not only economic, it was also profoundly sexualized and violent. The slave ship, which brought these people torn from Africa, symbolized the beginning of a cycle of endless suffering. Many did not survive the crossing, marked by hunger, disease, and torture. Those who managed to set foot on Brazilian soil were immediately classified, sold at auctions, and sent to the plantations. The crossing was only the first torment. The rest of life would be shaped by the whip, the punishments, and the feeling of no longer having the right to their own existence. For those who arrived, there was no guaranteed future, only the repetition of pain and the uncertainty of the next day. The slave system, therefore, was not merely an economic institution. It was a machine of dehumanization that produced wealth for a few and suffering for many. Every corner of the casa-grande, every stone of the senzala, every rattle of chains told a story of pain and resistance. The enslaved were treated as tools, yet they still found ways to preserve their humanity, whether in a song, a prayer, or in the silent gaze that resisted erasure. This subtle, almost invisible resistance will be one of the keys to understanding their struggle. The overseer, always present with his threatening figure, was the armed hand of the system. He represented institutionalized violence, ensuring that no captive dared to dream of freedom. But behind this rigidity, there was always the fear of the masters, fear of uprisings, of escapes, of losing control. The slave system lived in permanent tension, balanced between the absolute power of the owners and the silent resistance of those who refused to be completely defeated. As we close this first chapter, we can see that slavery in Brazil was not only a relationship of forced labor. It was a complete project of dehumanization, architected from the slave ship to the last day in the senzala. This system shaped society, created deep wounds, and left marks that can still be felt today. And it is within this structure of power, marked by violence and absolute control, that enslaved women became the most vulnerable targets. In the next chapter, we will dive into their stories, understanding their pain, their struggle, and how they were turned into symbols of submission, but also of resistance. If enslaved men carried the weight of the fields, of chains and shackles tearing their ankles, enslaved women faced an even crueler pain. Beyond forced labor in the plantations and domestic services, they were seen as available bodies to satisfy the desires of the plantation masters. The casa-grande was not only the center of wealth and ostentation, it was also the setting of a perverse silence, where the so-called torment of the night was repeated in secret, hidden from the words of history, but etched in the memory of generations. Enslaved women were taken from the senzala at nightfall. They walked barefoot, often still bound by iron chains, to the chambers of the casa-grande. Fear was not only in their eyes, but in their entire bodies, marked by the exhaustion of the day and the certainty that the night would bring no rest. For them, the whip, the whipping post, and the pillory were not the only instruments of pain. There were also forced whispers, unwanted touches, the silent violence that turned them into prisoners of both body and mind. These women lived under the weight of invisible chains, far beyond those rattling at their ankles. They were chains that made them believe they had no voice, that their existence was reduced to serving, obeying, and keeping silent. These chains were reinforced by the hard gaze of the overseer, always present to ensure that nothing escaped control. The overseer, acting under the master's orders, imposed collective fear, reinforcing the idea that the lives of those women did not belong to them. The torment was not only physical, it was psychological, spiritual, and emotional. Within the daily life of the senzala, the day began before sunrise and ended only long after the last task was completed. Women cut sugarcane, carried water, washed clothes, cooked for the casa-grande, cared for the master's children, and were often forced to abandon their own young children to dedicate themselves to those of the ruling family. This cruelty dehumanized even the maternal instinct, making love constantly interrupted by orders and shouts. The enslaved were treated as tools, but women even more so, as objects of pleasure and domination. The torment of the night was one of the cruelest mechanisms of this system. It turned the space of intimacy into a prison. There were no witnesses beyond the walls of the casa-grande, but there were marks that could never be erased. The pain, the silence, the children born from this abuse. These children, often of mixed race, were seen as the property of the master, growing up between the stigma of color and the privilege of being half-blood, never truly belonging anywhere. Thus, violence was perpetuated generation after generation, sustaining the invisible chains of power. These women were punished doubly. When they resisted, the whip cut their skin, the whipping post immobilized their bodies, and the pillory exposed them to public shame. But when they submitted, they lost part of themselves, as if dignity was stripped away each night. Slavery did not bind them only with shackles and iron chains. It also imprisoned their souls, reducing them to eternal servants. Still, even amid horror, some found ways of silent resistance, hiding amulets, softly singing songs from their homelands, or simply looking up at the sky, seeking in the stars the memory of a lost freedom. The silence surrounding these abuses was complicit in the system. The casa-grande protected the master's secrets, while society looked away. The church often remained silent before these practices as well, reinforcing the idea that the masters were the fathers and protectors of the captives. This pact of silence reinforced the invisible chains, turning women's torment into something normalized, as if inevitable. The body of the black enslaved woman was turned into a territory of conquest, a field of power, a currency of exchange. Even so, each woman who suffered also left marks of resistance. Many became pregnant by force, but fought to protect their children. Some escaped to quilombos, where they tried to rebuild their lives far from the yoke of the casa-grande. Others used their voices in songs and prayers, passing on to the next generations the memory of both pain and hope. It was a form of cultural resistance, of keeping alive the identity that had been violently torn away on the slave ships. These women proved that even when marked by pain, they could also be symbols of resilience. The female vulnerability in the slave system, therefore, was not merely a consequence of a brutal regime, but a structural part of it. The master maintained control over the plantations through the men's labor, but consolidated his power through the domination of women's bodies. Fear, silence, and pain were weapons as powerful as the whip and the whipping post. This cruel logic not only shaped the period of slavery, but also left deep scars in society, still echoing today in gender and race relations. By the end of this chapter, it is clear that the vulnerability of enslaved women was not a detail, but the very center of the machinery of oppression. They were used as labor, as merchandise, and as instruments of pleasure. Their bodies were violated, their voices silenced, but their memory lives on. It is impossible to understand slavery without acknowledging the weight of this specific violence against women. And it is precisely within this context of vulnerability that the darkest space of all emerges, the so-called forbidden room of the casa-grande. There, in the silence of locked walls, abuse became routine, turning night into torment and leaving scars that spanned centuries. In the next chapter, we will open the door to this space and reveal the secrets that history tried to hide. Among the lamplit corridors of the casa-grande, there was a space rarely spoken of aloud, the so-called forbidden room. It was not part of social visits, did not appear in official records, nor in the master's inventories. It was a hidden space, kept under lock and key, where darkness concealed the most cruel practices of slavery. For enslaved women, this room was not just a chamber. It was an inevitable destiny, where silence became an internal scream and the body was reduced to an object. The Forbidden Room symbolized the pinnacle of the plantation master's power. Within it, the walls held secrets that not even time could erase. Many women were taken there under the harsh gaze of the overseer, who led them as if it were just another task to fulfill. Others were dragged by their arms, their wrists bound in shackles or still bearing the fresh marks of the whip. Crossing that heavy door, they knew there was no way out. Fear was as thick as the stifling air that dominated the room. Inside, there were no open windows to the outside world. The space was small, dark, lit only by torches that cast distorted shadows across the walls. There was no bed of comfort, but a simple structure designed only for torment. In some cases, the whipping post was present as a symbol of immobilization. In others, chains fastened to the walls revealed the clear function of that space. The iron chains and the invisible chains intertwined, creating an atmosphere of terror that no woman could forget. The torment was not only physical. The torment of the night was imposed in silence, with the certainty that no one would dare intervene. The entire casa-grande knew what happened there, but the pact of silence was stronger than any word. The master's wives pretended to ignore it, the other residents remained silent, and the overseer maintained order. Society accepted, legitimized, and perpetuated this violence, turning the Forbidden Room into a symbol of impunity. The sound of the whip echoed not only on women's backs, but also in their souls. Many were punished before or after the abuses as a way of reinforcing domination. The pillory outside the room was public punishment. The room itself was private punishment, no less cruel. Every tear shed in that darkness fed the chains of fear that prevented rebellions and silenced the cries that might otherwise have reached the quilombos. For enslaved women, the Forbidden Room was the place where time stopped. There was no future inside those walls. Many emerged marked not only by bruises, but by forced pregnancies, by memories they could not share, by a shame that was not theirs, but imposed upon them. Sexual violence was part of the machinery of slavery. It was used as a weapon of power, as proof of absolute control, as a way to affirm that those women did not even own their own bodies. Some tried to resist, even knowing that resistance could cost them dearly. There are accounts of women who bit, scratched, or screamed, only to be punished at the whipping post, flogged at the pillory until they lost consciousness. Others, in silence, endured, believing that preserving life was a form of resistance, to care for their children, to keep alive the hope of one day escaping to a quilombo. Impunity turned the Forbidden Room into a normalized space. It became part of the routine of the casa-grande, and at the same time, the dirtiest secret history tried to erase. By day, the masters appeared as respected figures of society. By night, they hid behind the heavy doors, revealing the cruelest face of power. This duality shaped the character of slaveholding society, the hypocrisy of a system that preached morality while sustaining violence. The women's pain did not end when the door of the room closed behind them. Returning to the senzala, they carried the weight of silence. They could not share what they had endured under threat of further punishment. Yet their fellow captives read it in their eyes, in the marks on their bodies. It was collective pain, a secret shared in the silence of the night, reinforcing the invisible chains that bound them all in the same experience of suffering. And even so, out of suffering also came resistance. Many women found ways to preserve their dignity, even in the face of violence. Some created protective symbols, softly sang songs that carried memories of Africa, or clung to their faith to endure the endless nights. Resistance may have seemed small, but it was powerful, for it prevented violence from completely erasing their humanity. The Forbidden Room of the casa-grande was not only a physical space, it was a symbol of how slavery turned women into prisoners of systematic violence. It was there that stories of pain were perpetuated, but also stories of survival. Today, by symbolically opening that door, we reveal not only what was hidden, but also the silent strength of those who resisted. In closing this chapter, we understand that the forbidden room was more than a space of abuse. It was a mechanism of control, a psychological weapon that kept all women under the yoke of fear. Yet from that same dark space arose stories of resistance, carried on through memory and oral tradition. And it is precisely from that room, steeped in pain, that the next stage of this narrative emerges: forced pregnancies and stolen love. In the next chapter, we will dive into the harsh reality of women who were forced to bear children of violence, and who, many times, had to watch those children be sold as merchandise at the pillories. Violence against enslaved women was not limited to the nights of torment inside the casa-grande. Often from that pain came children, conceived not in love but in imposition. They were forced pregnancies, born of a system that treated even motherhood as an extension of slavery. For the plantation masters, every child born to an enslaved woman meant an increase in their estate. Human life was counted as wealth, and the wombs of women were seen as instruments of production. These women had no right to choose. Their bodies were controlled, their relationships interrupted, even their emotions denied. Many times, they were torn from their companions, prevented from living genuine love within the senzala. The strength of the invisible chains lay not only in the shackles, but in the theft of affection itself. The slave system understood that dividing, separating, and preventing emotional bonds was a way of maintaining absolute control. The children born into this context rarely had a future of freedom. Many were quickly sold in public squares, displayed at the pillories as merchandise. The masters calculated the value of those small bodies with the same coldness used to evaluate cattle or sacks of coffee. The sight of desperate mothers having their children torn from their arms became a cruel symbol of slavery. It was a permanent mourning, lived in silence, since crying could be punished with the whip, the post, or the shackles. There was also the pain of broken relationships. Many couples formed within the senzala were separated when the master decided to use the woman to satisfy his desires or to sell her to another owner. Love was stolen before it had a chance to bloom. This emotional fragmentation served as a strategy of domination. Without strong bonds, it was harder to organize escapes, collective resistance, or strengthen communal identity. Thus, the masters manipulated not only bodies, but also emotions and dreams. The forced pregnancies also carried a devastating psychological weight. For many women, every new life conceived was a constant reminder of the torment they endured. Some children were born with mixed features, silently revealing the abuse. These children, though innocent, bore the mark of violence and inequality. They grew up divided between two worlds, not belonging to the casa-grande as legitimate heirs, nor fully accepted in the senzala, where they were sometimes seen as symbols of collective pain. This ambiguity reinforced the invisible chains that trapped all in a cycle of suffering. Despite the pain, some women tried to turn this burden into resistance. Some protected their children at all costs, hiding them when rumors of sale spread, asking other captives to take them away, or dreaming of fleeing to a quilombo where they could rebuild their families. Love, even stolen, still manifested in small gestures of care and sacrifice. It was the most powerful form of resistance against a system that sought to reduce everything to profit. Forced motherhood was also a strategy of the slave system. The more children were born, the more the masters guaranteed labor for the future, without depending on the risks and costs of the slave ships. It was a cold calculation, turning a woman's womb into a factory of new captives. This dehumanizing logic deepened the suffering, as it stripped women of the basic right to decide about their own bodies and their own lives. They were seen as machines, but they resisted as humans. Stolen love also appeared in stories of young women forced to lie with their own oppressors while their companions watched helplessly. The overseer and the masters knew that this spectacle of humiliation weakened not only the woman, but also the man who loved her. It was a violence that cut through everyone, breaking bonds and corroding hope. Still, within the senzala, silent alliances arose, knowing glances and gestures of affection that kept the flame of humanity alive. These stories, scarcely recorded in official books, survived through oral memory, passed down from generation to generation. Each account of a mother who lost her child, of a couple torn apart by force, of a love interrupted by the power of the casa-grande, is a testimony of resistance against historical erasure. By rescuing these voices, we give name and face to suffering, but also to the courage of women who, even amid horror, never stopped loving. As we close this chapter, it is impossible not to feel the weight of collective pain. Forced pregnancies and stolen loves were not accidents of the system, but central parts of slavery. They expanded the master's wealth, fueled the trade in children, and perpetuated the logic of domination. But at the same time, they revealed the resilience of women, who found in motherhood and stolen love reasons to resist and fight. And it is precisely this resistance that leads us to the next chapter. Because if the masters imposed pain, they also awakened courage. In the next part of our narrative, we will uncover the cruelest punishments used to discipline the enslaved, while also exploring the forms of resistance that arose amid chains, the whipping post, the pillory, and the whip. Order on colonial plantations was not maintained by justice, but by fear. The system of slavery in Brazil depended on mechanisms of terror that ensured silence and submission. For that, the plantation masters and their overseers relied on cruel instruments, turning punishments into spectacle and the bodies of the enslaved into stages of pain. The whipping post, the pillory, the whip, and the heavy shackles were not merely objects. They were symbols of a regime that made violence an everyday language. The whipping post was one of the most common forms of punishment. Made of heavy wood, it immobilized arms and legs, forcing the body into painful positions that could last for hours or even days. There, the captive remained exposed, unable to move, feeling joints twist, blood flow restricted, and tears running silently. The post was not only physical punishment, but also psychological. It showed the rest of the senzala that any attempt at resistance would carry a heavy price. The pillory, on the other hand, was the stage of public humiliation. Raised in the squares of towns and villages, this stone or wooden pillar held the bodies of the enslaved, flogged before the eyes of the population. The goal was clear: to turn the suffering of one into a lesson for all. The sound of the whip tearing skin echoed as a warning, and the scars left on the back became permanent reminders. Each blow carried the message that the captives' lives did not belong to them, and that discipline was enforced through torment. The whip, made of rawhide, was the most feared instrument. Its cracks cut the air, and moments later the flesh. The lashings varied according to the offense committed, from minor disobedience to attempted escape. In many cases, the plantation masters ordered 50, 100, or even 200 lashes, until the body could endure no more. The whip symbolized absolute power, a reminder that pain was the price of insubordination. The shackles, heavy iron rings fastened to the feet or neck, completed the cycle of oppression. With them, the enslaved were forced to work more slowly, carrying not only the weight of the chains, but also the psychological weight of knowing freedom was impossible. The clinking of iron chains was a macabre music, reminding them with every step of their captivity. And the invisible chains, even more cruel, infiltrated the mind, making them believe there was no escape. Despite so much violence, the flame of resistance never went out. In the darkness of the nights inside the senzala, captives created strategies to keep their humanity alive. They sang songs of African origin, which soothed not only their weary bodies, but also carried the memory of their roots. In these songs were codes of communication, messages of hope, and often plans for escape. Song was more than sound. It was cultural resistance. The quilombos emerged as the boldest response. They were communities formed by those who escaped, organizing themselves in the forests to live far from the yoke of the casa-grande. There they reinvented freedom, cultivated the land, and preserved traditions torn away by the slave ships. Each quilombo was a cry against the chains, an act of courage that defied the masters and their overseers. The existence of these places proved that no matter how heavy the shackles, the pursuit of freedom could never be erased. Even inside the casa-grande itself, there were subtle forms of resistance. Some women sabotaged meals, others hid objects, and there were those who simply refused to smile before the master, using their gaze as a silent refusal. These small, almost invisible gestures showed that domination was never absolute. Resistance did not always need to be loud. Sometimes it only needed to be persistent. Even punished at the whipping post, even flogged at the pillory, even bearing the scars of the whip, the enslaved found ways to assert their dignity. They created dances, religious rituals, prayers, and legends that kept alive their connection to their origins. Faith became a powerful weapon against oppression, strengthening the community before both the visible and invisible chains. The masters believed punishments destroyed the will to fight. But in reality, each blow only fed the desire for freedom. Overseers with their cruel stares were feared but also hated. Many of them became targets of revolts, and there were cases in which they paid with their own lives for the blood they shed. Every act of rebellion, every escape, every quilombo established was proof that resistance was as strong as the punishments. Closing this chapter, we realize that violence was the fuel of the slave system, but also its greatest weakness. The more the masters tried to subjugate the enslaved with whips, posts, and shackles, the more they awakened in them the desire to resist. The punishments left deep scars, but they did not extinguish the flame of freedom. And it is precisely this flame that leads us to the next point of this narrative. In the next chapter, we will understand how the pains of the past did not end with abolition. The scars of slavery continue to echo today in the form of inequality, racism, and invisible chains that still imprison mentalities. It is time to speak of the legacies of pain. The signing of abolition did not mean the immediate end of slavery's pain. When the Golden Law was proclaimed in 1888, the enslaved were declared free, but they were not given land, homes, education, or any form of reparation. They were released from iron chains, but remained bound by invisible chains that stretched across generations. The promised freedom was nothing more than an abstract concept, for reality still kept them marginalized, pushed into misery, excluded from the society they had built with blood and sweat. The marks of forced labor still echoed in body and mind. Many carried scars from the whip, memories of the post, and permanent pain caused by shackles. These wounds were not only physical, they were memories engraved in skin, in soul, and in lineage. The families who lived through slavery passed on to their children and grandchildren not only stories of suffering, but also the silent traumas of those treated as merchandise. These psychological scars are invisible legacies, hard to erase, and they continue to influence how many black people see themselves in the world. The pillory, which once served as a stage of public humiliation, ceased to be used as a physical instrument but continued to exist symbolically. The shame imposed on skin color persisted, feeding structural racism. Even after legal freedom, the descendants of enslaved women continued to be seen as cheap labor, as bodies available for domestic service, as second-class citizens. Slavery had ended on paper, but society preserved the logic of inequality. These invisible chains manifested in social exclusion. Without access to land, the freed were pushed to the margins, surviving in precarious conditions. Many became underpaid workers, repeating in new forms the cycle of forced labor. Marginalization created a gulf between whites and blacks, one that endures today in income, education, and opportunity levels. The legacy of pain did not remain in the past. It has updated itself in every generation, shaping the present. The devaluation of African culture was another way of perpetuating control. African-based religions were persecuted, music and dances were mocked, languages and traditions were erased. This attempt to destroy cultural identity was an extension of the chains. The system knew that without memory, submission would be easier to maintain. Yet despite repression, much of the culture survived, passed on in secret, in songs, in popular festivals, in whispered prayers within homes. This cultural resistance was an act of survival against the chains that sought to silence voices. Collective trauma also manifested in effective relationships. During slavery, entire families were separated, children sold, mothers torn from their homes, loves interrupted. This rupture of bonds left deep marks on the way many generations understood family. The difficulty of maintaining stable ties was a direct consequence of a system that saw affection as a threat. Even today, this legacy can be perceived in the silent pains that cross black families, heirs of a past marked by fragmentation. Enslaved women, in particular, left a legacy of both suffering and resistance. They were victims of sexual violence, of forced pregnancies, and of the loss of their children. These painful memories became invisible marks, passed down from mother to daughter. Distrust, fear, and at the same time the strength to resist and protect their descendants are legacies that remain alive. Every scar, every story whispered in family intimacy is proof that violence did not end with abolition. It merely changed form. Structural racism is perhaps the cruelest of these legacies. It manifests in the suspicious gaze, in the difficulty of accessing jobs, in police violence, in constant marginalization. They are new forms of pillories, raised in modern streets, continuing to expose and punish the descendants of the enslaved. They are invisible chains that no longer need iron to imprison, for they are rooted in the mind of society. This continuity shows that abolition was only a starting point, but it was never accompanied by true justice. Even so, it is important to remember that along with the legacies of pain, there are also legacies of resistance. Every preserved song, every worship service held in secret, every community formed on society's margins was a way of refusing to let the past be completely erased. Pain and resistance walk together, showing that no matter how much the system tried to destroy, the flame of freedom never went out. Closing this chapter, we understand that the legacies of slavery did not remain confined to the 19th century. They are still alive in the 21st century, shaping behavior, fueling prejudice, and maintaining inequalities. The invisible chains still bind, but knowing this history is the first step to breaking them. And it is precisely about this that we will speak in the next chapter. Because in the midst of silence, some voices survived. They are stories that still echo today, crying out to be heard. In the next part of this narrative, we will give space to the voices of enslaved women who resisted and who, though silenced in the past, continue to echo in the collective memory. Even under the weight of chains, of the post, of the pillory, and of the whip, enslaved women never ceased to exist as subjects of resistance. Their voices, though often silenced by the master's power and the overseer's vigilance, found ways to survive. They did not always manifest in screams or open revolts. Sometimes they echoed in soft songs, in stories whispered in the nights of the senzala, in prayers murmured beneath the moon. These voices crossed centuries, resisting attempts at erasure, and today reach us as living testimonies of courage and pain. In the darkness of the nights, while exhaustion consumed bodies after long days of forced labor, songs arose that lulled the little ones and comforted the adults. These songs were not just melodies. They were codes of communication, expressions of faith, and memories of Africa lost in the holds of the slave ships. Each verse was filled with hidden meanings, plans for escape, messages of hope, or simple declarations of humanity amid dehumanization. In this way, the women turned their voices into weapons against the invisible chains. Prayers were also forms of resistance. Many enslaved women blended African traditions with Christian teachings, creating syncretic religious practices that survive to this day. In prayer, they asked for strength, protected their children, invoked the memory of their ancestors. Each prayer was an act of faith, but also of subversion, for it showed that even before the whip and the constant fear, they still had something the masters could not control: spirituality. This inner strength kept entire communities alive, who found in faith the energy needed to endure the torment of the night. In the stories told in secret, there was also resistance. Mothers and grandmothers passed on to children narratives of African kings, queens, warriors, and heroines. These stories recalled lost greatness, reinforced identity, and fueled the dream of freedom. While the system tried to impose the idea of inferiority, these voices echoed as reminders that the enslaved came from strong peoples with culture, history, and dignity. Words became invisible walls against cultural erasure. The quilombos were places where those voices found freedom to expand. There, far from the vigilance of the casa-grande, traditions could be preserved with greater strength. Women played a central role in sustaining these communities, caring for the children, cultivating the land, transmitting songs and prayers. Each quilombo was also a space of memory, where the past was not forgotten and the hope of the future was strengthened. In these communities, voices echoed loud and clear, proclaiming that freedom was possible. Even within the casa-grande itself, there were echoes of resistance. Many women, forced to serve in kitchens and bedrooms, found ways to make their presence felt. Some sang softly, others looked the master straight in the eye as a silent act of defiance. These gestures seemed small, but they carried the weight of centuries of oppression and the certainty that, even reduced to objects, they were still human beings. Their voices, even silenced, echoed through glances, silences, and gestures filled with meaning. Over time, these voices became collective memory. They survived in oral traditions, in popular festivals, in African-based religions, in the dances and music that today form part of Brazilian culture. Every drumbeat, every ancestral song, every preserved prayer is an echo of the women who resisted. They transform pain into culture, humiliation into identity, suffering into resistance. Thus, what once seemed like silence revealed itself as a cry crossing generations. These voices also echo in today's struggle against racism and inequality. They are remembered in social movements, in academic research, in documentaries and books that recover the history of enslaved women. To speak of memory is also to speak of reparation. To hear these voices means to recognize injustice, but also to draw inspiration from the courage of those who never gave up. Every narrative recovered is a way of breaking the invisible chains that still imprison society. The echo of these voices teaches us that resistance is not measured only in great battles, but also in everyday gestures. A song, a prayer, a steady gaze, a protective embrace. All of this was resistance amid terror. Every woman who dared to love, protect her children, pass on her culture, or simply survive left behind a powerful legacy. Their voices were not erased, they were multiplied. Closing this chapter, we understand that the memory of enslaved women does not belong only to the past. It remains alive in the present, echoing in our music, our beliefs, our struggles. These are voices that cry out for justice, recognition, and freedom. They remind us that history is not only made of masters and overseers, but also of the silent strength of the women who resisted. And it is with these voices, echoing across the centuries, that we approach the conclusion of this narrative. In the next chapter, we will reflect on how remembering is resisting, on how memory can transform the present, and on how the recognition of pain can open the path to true freedom. It is time to honor these women and turn their voices into action. We have reached the end of this journey through the shadows of slavery, but not the end of the story. Everything we have seen, the pain of the senzala, the power of the casa-grande, the abuses of the plantation master, the cruelty of the overseer, the torments of the whipping post, the pillory, the whip, and the shackles, are not just distant accounts. They are living marks that still echo today as invisible chains in our society. Every memory narrated here reveals that the violence suffered by enslaved women was not only individual but collective, shaping the social structure we inherited. These women were branded as merchandise, forced into labor, violated in silence within the forbidden rooms, compelled to bear children and to see them sold as if they were objects. Their bodies became territories of domination, but also of resistance. Every tear that fell, every song that echoed in the night of the senzala, every gesture of a mother protecting her child was a form of struggle. Even when reduced to silence, they turned their pain into memory, and their memory into a weapon. What makes this story even more urgent is realizing that it did not end with abolition. Structural racism, social inequality, marginalization, and prejudice are direct inheritances of centuries of violence. The invisible chains continue to bind minds and bodies, no longer with iron, but with exclusion, discrimination, and indifference. That is why remembering these women is not only an exercise in history, it is a political, spiritual, and human act. It is recognizing that the past lives in the present, and that we can only transform it if we have the courage to face it. Throughout this video, you have heard voices that were silenced by force, but found ways to echo all the way to us. These voices call for justice, for memory, for action. To honor enslaved women is to give them a place as protagonists, to recognize their strength, to learn from their resilience. It is also to assume the responsibility of breaking the chains that still attempt to imprison entire communities in cycles of poverty and prejudice. But there's also a legacy of hope, because even amid darkness, these women showed that freedom cannot be erased. They resisted in songs, prayers, escapes, quilombos, firm gazes, and silent gestures. They taught us that humanity always finds a way to rise, even when everything seems lost. This is the legacy we must carry, the certainty that resistance is possible and that remembering is also liberating. So, as we close this narrative, I want to make you an invitation. May this story not remain only here, in this video. May it echo in your conversations, in your reflections, in your choices. May you become part of this movement of memory and resistance so that silence will never again cover pain, and so that lives will never again be marked by injustice. They were branded by force, but today we can mark the difference through awareness. They were silenced, but today we can amplify their voices. They were seen as objects, but today we can recognize them as symbols of courage and dignity. And if this story touched your heart, I ask you, like this video, leave your comment, and share it so that more people may know this truth. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because here, together, we will continue rescuing silenced memories and transforming pain into awareness. Because remembering is resisting. Because their voices echo within us. Because every broken chain is one more step toward true freedom.